Okay, perfect. Um, right, so this session is going to be the same as the one I'm going to do on Tuesday and then also on Thursday, if there is PAL on Thursday. I think there should be, but it's also the last day of classes, so I'm not sure. I'll get back to you about that, or like obviously you'll see like a notice or something posted on D2L by Angela. But yeah, so this week we're going to do a recap of lectures 25 to 27. So yeah, let's start with lecture 25. So this one was called Organisms Assemble in Populations and Communities, and this was part one because lecture 26 is part two of that. So kind of a good place to start would be to figure out how we categorize units of life. So like basically if you were to zoom in on the earth, like really like on a really small scale, and then if you were to zoom out throughout those like I guess like with every frame that you see, there's like a different way to name what you're looking at, if that makes any sense, in terms of how like in terms of the life forms that you're looking at. So, for example, if you were to look really, really closely, like even just talking about another person, that's an organism, right? That's a single individual. So that's probably like the smallest scale that we're going to be talking about like this week and I guess basically throughout the semester. In bio 10, 12, you don't talk too much about like molecular things, whereas in bio 1001, you do talk a lot more about some of the biochemical reactions in more specific contexts. So this is probably the smallest we're going to get in terms of scale. And then next up would be the population. So the population is a group of individuals in the same species that live in the same area, in the same habitat. So it's still a pretty small scale, and it doesn't include any of the other species that live there, but just the individuals of one single species that live in one area. And then next up, like even further, you have communities. So communities are populations of several species, but still in that same habitat. So it's kind of like the population in terms of the habitat that you're looking at, but this time you're also including members of other species. And then the ecosystem would be a further like zooming out, and that is the habitats, community, and its abiotic factors. So now you're also including some of the non-living things that are there. So like the wind and the trees and the water and things like that, all of those are abiotic or non-living factors. So in an ecosystem, you're also including those and how they I guess like work with the biotic factors in that ecosystem to keep it healthy. And then further from there, you have your landscape, which is the patchwork of ecosystems across a larger area. So it's kind of like a bunch of ecosystems together. So you're kind of zooming out even more. And then lastly, on probably the most macroscopic scale, you have the biosphere. So this is all of the landscapes that are inhabited by living organisms on Earth. So that one's pretty self-explanatory. So yeah, it's kind of interesting to see how you can go from talking about organisms on such a small scale to talking about the entire biosphere. In terms of this course, though, you do mostly talk about organisms, of course, populations, communities, and ecosystems. You don't really do much about the landscape in the biosphere, although you kind of touch on them very slightly. But in terms of explicit explanations, it's mostly the first four categorizations. So let's talk about populations, which again are individuals of the same species that live in the same habitat. So how do they change in terms of their size? So a population can increase if there are births and if there is immigration, meaning that if there are other members of that species that are coming into that habitat. But a population can decrease if there are deaths and if there is emigration. So emigration is basically the opposite of immigration, and it means that animals are, or like individuals of that species, are leaving that population and going to a different one. So all populations have births and deaths. This is inevitable in real life. You can't actually prevent either of them. I mean, I guess like in certain cases you could control birth, but in general, like in a natural population, births and deaths are always there. But the things that can be controlled, and it depends obviously on the population, would be immigration and emigration. So if that population is located in a very remote habitat that's really difficult to leave or to enter, then that population is probably not going to be experiencing much emigration and immigration just because of its location on Earth. So yeah, that's just something that you might want to keep in mind. And it also leads us to dealing with some of these equations, which kind of look disgusting on the outside, but if you actually like kind of understand them and you take the time to look through them and understand the explanations, I promise they're not that bad. So yeah, there are several equations that you can use to categorize or to quantify the changes in a population, and it all depends on what you're trying to determine and which variables you're choosing to ignore. Because in this course, you do, for the most part, ignore immigration and emigration, and you're assuming assuming that this is a population that doesn't experience those factors. And so the only thing that would contribute to the change in the population size would be the birth rate and the death rate, as opposed to also including immigration and emigration. So in general, there are some variables that are used throughout these equations. So the first is capital N, which is the population size. And so if you've ever done physics, you might know what the symbol is. It's delta. So that just means change in, right? So this part right here, so delta N over delta T means the change in the population size over the change in time. So basically what you're saying is the change in population size over time. So that's what this means. So you're going to see this as a recurring theme throughout these equations, so just keep that in mind. Capital B is the number of births, and then capital I is the number of immigrants, capital D is the number of deaths, and then capital E is the number of emigrants. So again, immigration increases a population size and emigration decreases a population size, which is why I have them in green and red respectively. And so let's get started with these equations. I just numbered them arbitrarily, just in the order that they were listed in your slides, but it doesn't it's not like they are actually called like equation 1 and equation 2. So yeah, this first one's pretty simple and it makes sense. We kind of already talked about it in words, but this time we're actually putting it with the variables that we already talked about. But yeah, so delta N over delta T is equal to B plus I minus D minus E. So this is exactly what we were saying. So the change in the population size over time is equal to the number of births plus the number of immigrants minus the number of deaths minus the number of emigrants. And that makes sense because these two, the latter two, so D and E, those are things that would decrease the population size. And so it makes sense why those are both subtracted. And then, sorry, I'm like losing my voice. I'm just going to take a quick drink. Okay, and then delta N over delta T is equal to B minus D. So that's the second equation, and it looks really similar to the first one. The only difference is, if you notice, we actually took out immigration and emigration. And so the reason why those were removed is for further simplification. And like I said before, your prof is kind of making it a bit easier for you by assuming that this population doesn't experience those factors. So this is essentially the same thing. It's just that we're assuming that this population doesn't have immigration or emigration. It just has births and deaths. So it's a natural population in that sense. So the population would be growing if the number of births was greater than the number of deaths. And that makes sense in two ways. One, because like obviously logically, if there are more births than deaths, then you're going to have overall a larger population. But then also because delta N over delta T is the rate of change in the population size over time. And so if that rate is positive, then you know it's increasing. And if that rate is negative, then you know it's decreasing, right? And so in order for this rate of change to be positive, then the B must be greater than the D, like logically speaking. And so that's why that makes sense. And then similarly, but also the opposite, the population would be shrinking in size if B was less than D, which makes sense because you would get a negative number, which means a negative rate of change. And then the population would be experiencing no change in size, or it would be a static population. That's another way of saying it. If the number of births was equal to the number of deaths, because that also makes sense, because then there would be no overall change, and your delta N over delta T would be 0, meaning that the rate of change is 0. So I feel like that was kind of simple, but where it gets a little bit more complicated is talking about per capita. So that's what we're going to do now. So this next equation is, this part's familiar. So delta N over delta T, or the rate of, the change in the population size over time is equal to little b times big N minus little m times big N. So there are B number of births, right? We already said that. And then M number of deaths. We already know that variable as well, in each N population per capita. So this is kind of what I was saying about where it gets a little bit different, is that per capita means per individual. So it's kind of a way of indicating the rate of change based on the number of individuals. So it's kind of like if I were to compare, like I live in Alberta, right? So if I were to compare the number of COVID cases we have here to the number of COVID cases, let's say PEI or New Brunswick has, it would be completely different. It would be like terrifying, right, to compare. But then let's say I compared it on a per capita basis, we would still have a lot more per capita, but it's not as terrifying as if I compared the absolute numbers. So basically what I'm trying to say is if you look at it in terms of the population sizes between the two provinces, that number becomes a lot more similar. But if I'm comparing the absolute number of cases, for instance, because we have so many more people than PEI or New Brunswick would, it's going to seem like so much more. I hope that makes sense, but that's basically what per capita is. It's kind of um, um, what's like a good way of, yeah, I feel like that's like the best way I can think of to explain it. It's kind of rationalizing that number and putting it in the context of the size of the thing that you're talking about. So rather than just talking about absolute numbers, you're comparing them on a level that's fair, if that makes sense. Let me know if you need a better explanation. I don't know if that made sense. Um, but yeah, so here's a new variable that you're introducing for this next equation. Oh my God, I'm losing my voice again. And that would be r. So this is a little r, and this little r is the rate of increase in the population size per capita. So that's what I was saying before. So this is per individual in the population. So it's not an absolute rate of increase. It's just the rate of increase if you were to consider the number of individuals in the population. So per individual in the population. So that would be the rate of, or like, yeah, the rate of increase in the population per capita would be the number of births minus the number of deaths. And so, yeah, B is the birth rate minus the death rate. And that makes sense because when you're talking about rates, you're talking about per individual or per capita. So the birth rate is going to be different than what births actually is, right? So births is like an absolute number, how many people were born. But a birth rate would be how many people were born per individual in the population. So you're dividing it by the population size, and that's what makes it per capita. So the rate of increase in the population per capita is equal to the birth rate minus the mortality rate or the death rate, if that makes sense. So here you're just kind of rationalizing the numbers as opposed to before when we were talking about absolute numbers. And then the fourth equation was the change in the population size divided by time, which you already know, and that's equal to little r times n. So again, little r is the rate of increase in the population per capita, and n is the population size. So this equation is the same as this one, but it has fewer variables. We've simplified it a little bit more based on the fact that we know that b minus m is r, so we kind of substituted that in. So if you actually compared them, you would see how like the math works between the two. But how would you know if the population is growing? Well, that would mean that the rate of increase in the population size per capita would be greater than 0. And that makes sense because R is literally that. It's literally the rate of increase. So if that rate is positive, you know that the population is growing. And then again, if it's negative, you know that the population is shrinking. And then if the population is experiencing no change in size, then R would be equal to 0 because then there would be no rate, the rate of increase in the population per capita would be 0. So yeah, just feel free to stop me if that doesn't make sense. I'm gonna open the Teams app on my phone just to be sure, because I don't want to keep switching between the app and, okay, I think no one is writing anything, yeah. All right, perfect. So yeah, if you wanted any practice questions, I found this website from some random like university or whatever, and it's not random. I don't really remember the name. That's why I'm calling it random. But yeah, so they have these questions that have to do with some of the variables that you talked about, and these ones in particular, 4, 5, and 12A, I found were really helpful, and they were a lot more relevant to what you're doing, whereas some of them were a bit more complex, and you just didn't need to worry yourself with that. So when I post this on D2L, which will be tonight, you'll have access to these. Give them a go, and then if you need any help, just let me know. I'd be more than happy to help you. Just shoot me a message on Teams. Okay, so now that we're familiar with population growth and some of the equations, let's look at some more graphical representations as opposed to just numerical ones. So right here, we're looking at two different growth curves. We've got the exponential growth curve, which is a theoretical one, and then the logistic or sigmoid or S-shaped growth curve. They all mean the same thing, but this is more accurate to how real life populations look. Okay, so let's look at the exponential growth curve. You can see on the y-axis, you have the population size, and on the x-axis, you have time. So we're looking at the population size and how that fluctuates over time. So you can see over here that you're starting out small, and then immediately you're experiencing exponential growth, meaning you're just getting higher and higher and higher and higher and higher. So that's kind of what that is. Now, this seems like the way that you would logically think that a population would grow in a perfect world, but there are a lot of things that are not considered. We're not considering the nutrient availability in that environment. We're not considering the competition between individuals in that population. We're not considering access to sunlight, access to oxygen, access to other things that it needs to survive. We're not considering predators potentially that could also affect the population size. There's just so much that you don't consider when you look at an exponential growth curve. So this is why this considers the growth of a population in a perfect world, right? This is like if we imagine that this was a perfect like utopia, and then each individual gave birth to another, like each female would give birth to like maybe two more babies, and each of those babies would give birth to two more, right? So that's kind of what this is. Like you're just imagining a perfect scenario where there's nothing that's hindering the growth of the population. But of course, in real life, in any sort of situation, no population will ever grow like this forever. It might start out like this, as you can see over here, but then it always has a plateau. And then sometimes it even goes down afterwards. Like let's say you were talking about the alley effect, and we'll talk about that later. But yeah, so this is kind of the theoretical one if we lived in a perfect world. Now, the more realistic depiction of population growth would be a logistic or sigmoid or S-shaped growth curve, right? So again, you're looking at the same axes. You have on the y-axis, you have the population size, and on the x-axis, you have the time. So again, we're looking at the change in the population size over time. And so this type of graph, or this type of graphical representation considers the environment that the population is in. So it's going to consider those factors that I mentioned over here, where this graph did not consider them. So this is more realistic. So this is kind of explaining to you the fact that growth slows down when the population is close to carrying capacity. Now, carrying capacity is a variable that we haven't discussed yet, but now we will. And this is a great way to introduce it. So you can see that carrying capacity is this threshold right here, and it's a population size where it's specific to each environment and to each population. But once the population reaches that carrying capacity, it's going to plateau and then maybe even decrease after. Now, we'll talk a little bit about how we actually determine the carrying capacity, but obviously not like in a specific way, but just some of the factors that go into thinking about it. So yeah, carrying capacity is also known by this variable K, it's a capital K, and it is the biggest or largest a population can be without running out of resources to keep its members alive. So in other words, it's the size of the population where their environmental resources are maxed out. So this is the absolute highest, or the absolute largest the population size can be before things start to go wrong, because the environment is unable to supply enough resources to keep that population alive, if that makes any sense. And so that also, it helps you kind of see why at this point it starts to plateau, because it doesn't want to exceed that carrying capacity. So why does this matter? Why does this variable matter? Well, this is what logistic growth is based on. So the closer a population is to its carrying capacity, the faster it starts to shrink. And then the farther away a population is to its carrying capacity, the slower it is to shrink. Because you can see only a small frame here in the population size and its growth, but you can imagine that if we extended this, there would be some oscillations over here where you could see that as soon as it starts to deviate too much from the carrying capacity, it's going to begin to rise and grow exponentially again. And then when it gets close to carrying capacity again, it's going to decrease sharply. So that's kind of what this is talking about over here. And all of I guess like the theory behind logistic growth curves all surround carrying capacity and what that does to the population. And again, carrying capacity is not the same with every population. It all depends on the population, the environment, sometimes even the time of the year. So it's all dependent on the resources that it's able to supply at a given time. And then the next thing we're going to talk about is the alley effect. So this is a good depiction of that. I don't know why I cut off the B in births per female, but you can imagine that that's there. So the alley effect is a phenomenon where the population is reduced when the population size is below a threshold value, which we called K underscore, or yeah, like K dash or something. So basically what this is saying is this threshold value is like a certain number depending on the population. And so if this population never goes anywhere near it, or if it's way below this threshold value and it never ends up going above it, sometimes the alley effect can come in and it's going to basically reduce the population growth or reduce the size of the population as a result of not being able to reach that threshold value. So that's where you would get a negative growth rate in that population size. And so again, this K underscore or the threshold value differs depending on the population in question. And since the population is continuing to decrease as a result of not being able to reach that value, then the alley effect can cause that particular population to become extinct over time. So let's say that not being able to reach the threshold value was an indicator that this population was unhealthy, then maybe the alley effect could come in, reduce the population size so dramatically that at some point it becomes extinct. And maybe that's for the best because then a new population can come in and colonize that environment, and maybe that one is more healthy and has more fitness in their genes, I guess. So that's kind of another phenomenon that I thought we should talk about. Just a reminder that exponential and logistic growth curves are theoretical. Even though I did say that logistic ones are more accurate, neither of them are actually perfect, of course, because real populations experience oscillations, like I was telling you before, and it fluctuates a lot more than those perfect little graphs we're showing you. So some populations, like human populations, experience nearly vertical rates of growth, which is really weird. You can actually see that from the old Stone Age to the modern age. You've had basically a linear growth. Like it's so weird. But most other populations do not do that. A lot of them will hover slightly above and slightly below carrying capacity like a wave. So they'll go a little bit above it, and then obviously everything goes to hell after that, and then they'll go way below it, and then they'll go above it again, and then they'll go way below it. So that's what I was saying before about the oscillations, is that these real life populations, if we were to actually quantify them in real life as they are, they would be a lot different than the graphical representations that we have, because of course these populations are unpredictable and they're not perfect, but these the graphs that we were talking about are a really good way for us to kind of conceptualize and predict some changes in the population size. And of course, if you're actually doing this work like legitimately and you're not like doing it for uni, like you're actually, this is your job, is to quantify and predict changes in populations, you're probably going to take some of these oscillations into consideration and be able to have like a more accurate depiction of the fluctuations. But for our purposes, the logistic and the exponential growth curves were perfectly fine for us to use, just keeping in mind that they're not actually accurate and that you do get oscillations around the carrying capacity and throughout the growth. So how close are we to reaching Earth's carrying capacity? So we have enough resources for each person to use 1.7 hectares of resources from the Earth, but North Americans alone, this isn't even considering other populations, North Americans alone use about 10 hectares of resources per person. So this is obviously not going to work out, right? Right now it's fine because our population size is quite low with respect to how high it could be, but obviously you can imagine that at some point we are going to start running into trouble with this. So how does this work? Basically what we're doing right now is we're borrowing resources, North Americans, we're borrowing resources from other or less unfortunate populations and also from future generations. So because of the fact that we're basically only given 1.7 hectares of resources each and we're overusing it like a lot, so we're using about 10 hectares each, you can imagine that this has to come from somewhere. So not only are we taking it from less and like more vulnerable populations and less fortunate populations, but we're also taking resources from future generations. And so that's kind of where the stuff about like climate change and everything comes in. And it talks about how this is fine for us. We're probably not going to be affected, but the future generations are going to be very, very severely affected based on our actions. So again, this is super unsustainable and we are living above our means, right? And so the estimated carrying capacity for the human population on Earth is about 10 to 15 billion individuals, which is kind of weird because if I'm not mistaken, I think we have like 8 billion or so, or almost 8 billion right now. I really have no idea. I should probably check that. But so the limit, I guess, or the carrying capacity would be 10 to 15 billion before we start to run out of resources. So you can imagine that we definitely need to take a closer look at the way that we use resources and what's actually necessary and what's not, and what we can do to reduce our impact. But yeah, so that was a kind of depressing note, but thankfully that's not the last lecture. I don't know if you can hear my mom vacuuming upstairs. Please let me know if it's too loud. I can just tell her to stop. I don't know why she's doing that. But yeah, so this is a recap of lecture 26. And this is just part 2 of the lecture that we were just reviewing right now. So let's talk about some of the ways we can categorize interactions between members in a community. And again, a community was this right here. So this is populations of several species in one habitat. So previous to this, we were looking at populations. Now we're looking at communities. So this is one step above. We've zoomed out a little bit more. Now we're considering the same habitat, but now members of different species and how they interact with one another in that habitat. So yeah, that's what we're looking at here. So you can see I made this table because, well, I made this last year, but I did something similar by hand for myself when I was in first year because I remember like reviewing the slides and I didn't really like the plus minus like a color oriented person, like I need to visually see it. So the plus minus thing wasn't doing it for me. So I just did this. Hopefully it helps. I'm not sure though. But basically, you can look at the types of interactions here and then the two organisms that are involved in that interaction. And we're going to compare some of the types of interactions based on what is benefiting, what is being harmed, and then also whether there is no benefit or harm. So let's start out with predation. So you might already know, but predation is basically when one individual from one species is going to hunt and try to chase and kill and eat whatever the second individual. So organism one, which is the predator, they are going to benefit. But organism two, which is the prey, obviously they're going to die, so they're going to be harmed, right? So this would be a predatory relationship. Now, herbivory is obviously just like an animal that eats a plant. So organism one, which is the animal or the consumer, they are going to benefit because they get the nutrients from the plant and they get that food source. But obviously the plant is going to die, so that is a harm. And then competition. In competition, both parties are harmed. It doesn't necessarily mean it's like severe and it doesn't mean that it's death, but in general, both of them are using resources to outcompete each other. So it's kind of a waste of resources if you want to think of it like that. So both parties are being harmed. Both of them are fighting each other essentially for either a mate or a food source or a habitat or something like that. Next, we have a group of terms that all have to do with symbiosis. So symbiosis means that these organisms need to be in direct contact, whereas it's a little bit different from facilitation, where the organisms are not are either indirect the organisms are not in direct contact with one another. So yeah, within symbiosis, you have the first relationship, which is parasitism. So obviously we kind of know what parasites are by now, but they're essentially organisms that exploit the resources of another organism. So for us, it could be like some bacteria are parasites, some viruses are parasites. They can infect us and then use our resources for their own benefit to propagate their population inside of us. We can get very, very sick from them. Some people die. It all depends on the species. But the point is, the parasite is obviously going to benefit, right? It gets a new host, so a new place to live. It gets all of its resources, which are our resources, and it gets to reproduce its whole population inside of that one host. And it has very little competition. It's great. But for us, of course, or the host itself, that's going to be a harm. It's going to be it's either going to get really sick, its nutrients are going to be exploited, or sometimes they can just die. So that's really unfortunate for them, and that's why you have this relationship. Now, mutualism, so if you think of like a mutual, it means kind of like the same or like equal. So both parties in a mutualistic relationship are going to benefit. So this would be, for example, some of those fungi that live symbiotically with plants and help them enhance their nutrient uptake. So in that sense, the plants are benefiting because their nutrient uptake is being enhanced. They get more nitrogen from the soil and things like that. But with the fungus, it's also benefiting because they get the products of photosynthesis from the plant. So they get access to carbohydrates and things like that. So in this case, both parties are benefiting. And then commensalism is where one party benefits and the other one is not affected. So one party doesn't have to benefit at the expense of another, like parasitism, but in this case, it's just like one is benefiting, the other one doesn't care, doesn't affect it, not being harmed, not being benefited, just doesn't matter. And now onto facilitation. So this is again where the organisms are not in direct contact with one another. So in this case, you can have two different scenarios. Either both parties will benefit or one of them will benefit and the other one is not harmed. But you don't have like one benefits and one is harmed, if that makes any sense. So yeah, thankfully you don't have to memorize this. Guess who did though in first year? So that's like one of the very few pros of online school. I'm not trying to say online school is great. Trust me, I'm not. But just saying, at least you just, you can just keep this thing, or like keep your notes from your prof, and you just have to look back at it, Command F and then, or Control F, and then look for the relationship. Just make sure that you understand it, of course, because open notes doesn't mean, just don't study. You already know that by now, though. Anyways, yeah, so that's what we're talking about in this recap. So that's about communities. So how do we categorize diversity in communities? So there are different terms that we can use to do this, but one of them would be species richness. So species richness is the number of different species in that community. So what is the species richness of this community? Well, I already put it here, so I was going to ask, but I already did that. So the species richness is 2, because you have cats and you have dogs, right? So you have 2 different species. Obviously, cat is not a species and dog is not a species. There are like actual specific ones, but for the purpose of this, like for simplicity, we're going to consider dog as a species and cat as a species. So yeah, there's 2 different species here in this community. So that is the species richness. That one's pretty easy. Now, let's talk about the species relative abundance. So the relative abundance is the number of individuals in a species divided by the total number of individuals. So let that sink in a little bit. It's not super complicated. It's just the wording that might make it tricky, which is why I have an example. So in this community, you have 8 dogs and 3 cats, right? So the species richness we already said was 2, because you have dogs and cats. But what is the relative abundance of each of these species? So the relative abundance of the dogs in the community is the following. So you know that you have 8 dogs, and you know that you have 11 animals in total. You have 11 individuals in the whole community. So you're going to do 8 divided by 11 to get 0.72. So this relative abundance of dogs in this community is 72%. This community is 72% dog. I mean, you can imagine that if you did this with like actual species, this would be beneficial. But like for this, it kind of seems a little bit weird and silly. But yeah, so what about the relative abundance of cats in the community? Again, you've got 3 cats and you have 11 animals in total. So that's 0.28. If you multiply that by 100, you get 28%. So the relative abundance of cats in this community is 28%. The relative abundance of dogs in this community is 72%. And then again, the species richness, because you have 2 species in this community, is 2. So why is diversity important in communities? Well, having more diversity means that you get more production, meaning that the turnover of energy that's harvested by organisms in the population is higher than it would be if you had less diversity. So you get, by production, that could be like photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, whatever. And there's also a better chance of recovering from some sort of disturbance. So disturbances, for the most part, negatively impact community diversity. It obviously depends on the disturbance and the population and if it was stable before. But in some cases, moderate disturbances are actually really good for increasing the diversity in the population. And so how does that even work? Well, basically, moderate disturbances force the community to recolonize. And if there were no disturbances at all, then the population would be old and there would always be like a dominant species that took over the environment. So in order to get that diversity and in order to kind of mix things up a little bit and have different species be the dominant ones in that community, then you want to have some minor disturbances, not ones that completely wipe out the population, of course, and also not ones that don't do anything at all, but something in between where maybe the weakest, I don't want to say the weakest links because that sounds terrible, but like naturally, like the natural selection perspective of kind of like, I really don't know how to say that without sounding terrible, but do you get what I'm saying? Like the disturbances kind of mix up the dynamics of that population so that there are new dominant species over time instead of it just being constant, and some things that are maybe not working out and that are hindering the progress of that community, they can be politely wiped out, and then the newer things that are probably more beneficial can, take over, if that makes any sense. Yeah, I really literally don't know how to say this without sounding awful, so that's it. So how many trophic or feeding levels can a community have? This is all like talking about like food webs and whatever, all that stuff that we learned about when we were kids, but on a more detailed level. So you can see that this is kind of an energy pyramid. You have your primary producers at the bottom, and then something called an apex predator at the top, but that's like really rare to have 5 trophic levels. Usually you just have 4, but you can have 5. It's just really, really rare, and you have very, very few of the top predator. But generally, you'll have primary producers and then primary consumers, secondary consumers, and then tertiary consumers. Here they call it third level, but that means the same thing. And then I guess in this case, you have an apex predator, which you could also call a quaternary consumer, but again, this is kind of rare. So the thing about this is that you can't just keep increasing the number of trophic levels that you have in your food web in a community, because there is a problem with the energy transfer between the trophic levels, and that's what we're going to talk about now. So only 10% of the biomass from the previous level is passed on to the next. So in this case, you have the sun's energy, right, shining down on these primary producers, these plants. And so we are imagining that we're setting 100% to the amount of energy that was captured from the sun, not the amount of energy that the sun gave off, because we already talked about this before, but primary producers are not very efficient at capturing the sun's energy. So whatever they did capture, we're calling that 100%. That's our baseline number. Then let's say you have a primary consumer that comes in and eats the primary producer. Only 10% of that energy from that primary producer is being passed on to the primary consumers. The rest of it is lost as heat, which is actually crazy how inefficient this is. And then the primary consumers are going to be consumed or eaten by the secondary consumers. And again, only 10% of that is going to be passed on to that secondary consumer. And then you just kind of keep going. But you notice that you have a dramatic decrease each time with each successive trophic level. So you can imagine that at some point, if you keep going, you're not going to have very much energy at all on that trophic level. And it's not going to be enough to keep that individual or to keep the individuals in that level alive. So that's why that kind of provides like a limitation to the number of trophic levels you can have, because there's simply not enough energy being captured between each energy transfer, because you lose a lot of energy as heat. And then of course you have, this is like decomposers that come in and eat all of the dead organisms from each of these trophic levels. Then they can recycle the nutrients, and then it goes back to the primary producers, whatever, you know the drill. But yeah, so the point is only 10% of the biomass from the previous level is passed on to the next level. So there is a natural limit for trophic levels and how many you can have in a community, and that's usually 5 or fewer. Typically it is fewer than 5, but in this example it does show you 5. Otherwise, the top predator would have many energetic restrictions. And you can also see that the population sizes in general, as you go up each trophic level, those are also decreasing, right? So you have a lot more primary producers than you do apex predators or tertiary consumers. And that's again simply because they don't have as much energy in this trophic level as they do down here, so they can't afford to keep a higher population. Okay, so now our last recap of this afternoon, which was on lecture 27, and this was on ecosystems. So again, quick reminder, we already talked about organisms 7 million times. Then we talked about populations today. We also talked about communities, and now we're going one level up to ecosystems. So again, this is kind of if you zoomed out and you looked at some of the abiotic factors in that habitat as well. So we're looking at the same habitat as before, except this time we're also including, for example, if it's an aquatic one, we're including the water. We could be including rocks, we could be including dirt, we could be including sunlight, all those things that we didn't consider before. Those are all a part of the ecosystem. So yeah, let's talk about energy and nutrient cycling. So ecosystems need a constant input of energy, and there is energy lost in the form of heat with each energy transfer. Matter, for the most part, is recycled, but it can also be lost as well. And again, just as a reminder, remember when we talked about the laws of thermodynamics, and we said that energy cannot be created or destroyed. So whenever I say that energy is lost, it's not actually being lost like it's getting destroyed. It's just being lost as heat for the most part to the environment. And then also for matter as well, that matter is not actually lost, but it's just being it's basically converted to a form that's unusable by the ecosystem. So that's why we call it lost. It's not actually like it's gone, because that doesn't work. It doesn't work like that. So yeah, this kind of shows you a really messy example of some of the energy and nutrient cycling that you can have. So this in blue would be the nutrient cycling or chemical cycling, and then in orange you would see the energy flow or the energy cycling. So you start out with the sun, of course, it's shining down on those primary producers, things like plants. Of course, as they try to pass on some of that energy to the primary consumers and some of that matter, some of that energy is lost as heat. again, with each energy transfer, you lose energy as heat, so that totally makes sense. And then obviously these primary consumers are going to be consumed by the secondary consumers. And so these secondary consumers, during this energy transfer, the primary consumers are also going to lose energy as heat. Then the secondary consumers are consumed by the tertiary consumers. And again, they lose some of that energy as heat. And then the tertiary consumers are basically, when they end up passing away, like first of all, whenever they receive that energy, they're going to lose some of it as heat. But then also when individuals from each of these trophic levels die, you have microorganisms and other detritivores or decomposers that come in, and they can decompose these organisms, their corpses, and then they can create detritus, which is like poo, basically poo and like other nutrients and whatever, and that can be used again to fuel the primary producers. It can be used for fertilizer and things like that, and enhancing nutrient uptake in the soil for those primary producers. So you can see that you're never actually losing the matter, but it's just technically lost from each of the trophic levels because it's converted into detritus by detritivores and other decomposers. And you can also see that you're always losing energy as heat, always, right? So with each energy transfer, you're always losing some of it as heat, sometimes more than others. And what else was like a good thing to point out? I feel like that's it. Yeah. Basically, it's like a good little cycle, but you can see how some of it, like especially with energy, it's not actually fully being cycled. It's just being lost as heat to the atmosphere. Okay, so now it's equation time again because you just didn't get enough before. So this time we're going to do an equation called NPP equals, it's not called NPP. I don't know why I said that. The equation is NPP equals GPP minus RA. Not sure why I can't even remember what these stand for, but I think this is, let me see, I think I have it open. Yeah. NPP stands for net primary production. GPP is gross primary production. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Sorry, I don't know why I forgot that. I always like, even in first year, I just used the variables. I never actually remembered what it was called. But yeah, so NPP is the total amount of energy that consumers have access to, right? It doesn't mean that this is the amount of energy that they're actually able to use. Like it's not the amount of energy once you consider how efficient they are at capturing it, but it is the amount of energy that's available to them as a result of production by the primary producers. So what goes into that number? Well, basically GPP is the first thing, so that is gross primary production. So this is the entire amount of photosynthesis, or if it's a different kind of organism that doesn't do photosynthesis but it does something similar, maybe chemosynthesis, but the goal is the same, right? So they're both producing energy. So this is the entire amount of photosynthesis per unit of area and time. So this is like the total production by those primary producers, if you want to think of it like that. And then you have to subtract RA. So what is RA? RA is the amount of energy that is made by those primary producers, but they keep it for themselves. They don't pass it on because, again, even they need energy. They also perform cellular respiration if we're talking about plants. So plants also need some of the carbohydrates that they produce from photosynthesis so that they can use that for cellular respiration, the same way that we do. So yeah, so if you look at this, it does make sense, right? The net primary production, or the net amount of energy that is available to consumers for their own use, is equal to the amount of energy that's produced by the primary producers minus the amount that they keep for themselves so that they can perform cellular respiration and other biochemical reactions. So that actually makes sense in this case. So yeah, let's talk about a different term, which is production efficiency. And this has to do with what the fate of the energy from the primary consumer that was from the primary producer that was consumed by the primary consumer. So what I'm trying to say is, like, we said that NPP is the amount of energy that's available for those consumers, for the primary consumers that they can access, but what do they actually do with that, and how much of that energy can they actually ends up being used, and how much of it is lost as heat is what I'm trying to say. So 50% of the energy that is consumed, based like 50% of this NPP that they have access to, is excreted as feces. So it's actually unusable and it's just poo. And of course, like the detritivores can come in and deal with that, but for now it's just poo. And then 50% of it is assimilated, so meaning that it's actually able to be used by the organism. So you get kind of a half and half. Right off the bat, you already lose 50% of that energy. Now, 66% of this 50% is used for cellular respiration. And that makes sense as well because you would need that energy for that. But 33% of the 50% is used for actual growth of the organism. So you can see that a very, very small amount of the energy that's available in that MPP is actually being used for the growth of the organism, and that is what production efficiency is. So in this case, production efficiency would be 33% in this case. So let's talk about the difference between energy pyramids and biomass pyramids. So both of these are representations of net productivity in an ecosystem, but one of them represents energy transfers, so in the form of joules, that's the unit, and then the other one represents biomass at each trophic level, and that is in kilograms, because biomass is the total mass of the individuals at each trophic level. So that's going to be like in kilograms, whereas an energy pyramid would obviously measure energy, so that would be in joules. So that's kind of what you're seeing over here. Although this doesn't show you in joules, you are talking about energy. So you can imagine that if they showed you what that 10% actually was, like in terms of joules, it would let you know. So let's say this was 100 joules. This would be 10 joules, 1 joule, 0.1 joule, 0.01 joule, right? So we're all talking about energy units, so that would be joules, and that's why it's an energy pyramid. Whereas here, you're looking at the same dynamic where you're looking at primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and then maybe even quaternary consumers. But instead of looking at it in terms of the energy that's being transferred, you're looking at it in terms of the biomass at each trophic level. So again, what I was saying before was that you would always, typically, in a stable population, you would have a higher biomass in the bottom trophic levels as compared to the ones at the top. And that makes sense because you just simply have more energy at the bottom ones as compared to the top. So you can afford to have a larger population size at the bottom trophic levels as compared to the top as well. So that's what you're seeing over here. You can see like a very drastic reduction in the biomass with each successive trophic level. So what's stopping the net primary production of an ecosystem from getting infinitely greater? What's the problem? Like what's stopping it from just getting higher and higher and higher? Is there something that's limiting it? The answer is of course yes. So in terrestrial or land ecosystems, the limiting factors are temperature and water. Whereas in the ocean or in the aquatic ecosystems, obviously access to water is not a problem and temperature is typically not a problem, but the limiting factors would be the light that's available and the nutrients that are available. So yeah, let's talk about terrestrial ecosystems. So when it gets too cold or too dry, which is also known as being arid, the primary producers might not be able to perform the adequate amount of photosynthesis because, again, photosynthesis uses a lot of enzymes, right? So enzymes are types of proteins for the most part, and proteins are super, super sensitive to environmental changes. They're sensitive to changes in pH, changes in temperature, all these things, right? So if they don't have if it's too dry or too cold or whatever, then this could affect the efficiency of the enzymes that are used to perform photosynthesis. And so that's why you could be limiting the amount of photosynthesis that you produce based on those factors. So that's why these are limiting factors in terrestrial ecosystems. But again, in oceanic or in aquatic ecosystems, you have like light is a limiting factor because especially when you talk about an ocean, it gets super, super deep. And so you can imagine that you're getting less and less sunlight the deeper you go. So this might not be a problem for organisms that live near the top of the water, but the ones that live like deeper in the water are obviously going to be struggling with their access to light for the most part. And then also nutrients, because that always depends on the nutrient cycling. It takes a long time for nutrients to travel from the top, which is usually where the primary producers are, all the way to like the bottom, right? So that's also typically a limiting factor, especially when you talk about getting deep in the ocean. So it gets darker as you go deeper in the ocean, and photosynthesis requires a certain minimal level of sunlight exposure in order for it to happen, right? So this depends on the organism in question and their efficiency of photosynthesis, which is why there's not like one compensation point, which we'll talk about now. It's just like it always depends on the species that you're talking about. But at some depth in that ocean, which is called the compensation point, there's not enough sunlight for the autotrophs to thrive. So an autotroph, again, is an organism that produces its own food using sunlight. So photosynthesis, for example, anything that's photosynthetic would be called an autotroph. So that's what I mean by that. But if they don't have a certain threshold amount of sunlight access because of how deep they live in that water, then like in that body of water, like in an ocean, then they're at that compensation point or maybe below the compensation point, and then they're not able to thrive in that environment, so they can't perform photosynthesis in that environment. So that is how that factor is limited. And then again, with nutrients, that could have to do with nutrient cycling. Typically, you have things like phytoplankton and stuff, all these primary producers that live near the top of the water. And the reason for that is because that gives them more access to sunlight, which is what they need for photosynthesis. But you can also imagine that the nutrients that they produce as a result of photosynthesis take a really long time for them to be transferred all the way down to the bottom of the ocean, or like, deeper in the ocean, because it all depends on nutrient cycling, and it also depends on if there are animals that carry some of those nutrients down for them. But the point is that as you get deeper, these two factors become very limiting, and so that's why there are very few organisms that actually can live past this compensation point, like deeper than that. And they obviously have very special adaptations that allow them to do so. And you don't really need to know too much about that. But yeah, just kind of understanding that these are limiting factors, and it all depends on where the organism lives. Okay, so that was actually that, and we actually did it under an hour, which is so cool. But thank you so much for coming, not only to this session, but for just, staying with me for the entire year if you were in Bio 1001 for semester 2. I know it's been literally a disgusting year. I totally understand what it's like to be in online school, but I don't understand what it's like to be in online school for your first year. So honestly, you did it, never been done before, can't even believe it. So proud of you. But yeah, so you're basically there. You've basically made it. Enjoy your last week of classes. I know you're probably feeling the burnout. I can only imagine. But if you just, keep it pushing, take care of yourselves, you're almost there. The finish line is so close. And if you need anything at all, please feel free to shoot me a message on Teams. I'm way better at answering on Teams than I am on email because I always get random spam on my email. So yeah, I don't know. Let me know if you guys have any questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen or whatever. Okay. Yeah, does anyone have any questions? And if not, I will be uploading everything this evening, all my worksheets, this lecture, the other stuff. And then, yeah, if you have any suggestions for your exam review or whatever, feel free to drop those. Also, message me on Teams or something. Yeah, that's actually it. So I see someone's typing, so I'm just gonna let them finish typing in case they have a question. Oh, okay. No problem. Bye, guys. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.